Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights here with Charlie Araujo. How are you today?
I am great. I've been going all day. It's been nonstop. So I'm sort of on fumes, but I'm running on adrenaline. So I'm ready to go. And I need it because it has been an insanely busy news week when it comes to enterprise IT.
I
So
know everybody is back to work. We had some quiet weeks where it seemed like people were trying to figure out what was happening with either the government or just the new year or whatever. But I think all that is done and people are back to shipping and announcing and getting things done.
and there's no shortage. I think it's going to be a busy few months. Lots of announcements. Everyone is, I don't even say playing catch up. It's just like, I feel like we're sort of on one of these. It's like when your kids go to the park and the parents just want to have some downtime. So they say, okay, it's a race, run. And it's like you run and you realize they didn't tell us where to or what direction. We just know we're all going vaguely that way. Sort of what it
Yes.
feels like right now.
I know. I've never seen so much tech in my life going straight from the lab to product and into CIO office hands. It's amazing to watch. That part is legitimately amazing to me.
All right, well, let's dive in. We're actually starting with, I think, somewhat sad news for both you and I, maybe for slightly different reasons, but news, I guess, is breaking. I mean, I don't know. This isn't. It's they're early talks right now, but the talks are of both Broadcom and TSMC, Taiwan chip. I forgot the time. What is it?
Semiconductor
Semiconductor.
manufacturing, yeah.
Um, Basically both exploring deals to potentially buy parts of Intel, which of course means the potential breakup of Intel, which, we've talked about them having lots of issues. And I'm not saying it's not the right thing to do given everything and where they're at, but it's just sort of sad. I mean, this is one of those examples of a company that everyone, probably myself included, felt like was indomitable, would always be there, and
Hmm.
now under very legitimate threat of no longer existing as we knew it, if at all. And so, sort of sad news.
Yeah, for most of my career, Intel has been seen as the absolute epitome of supply chain and manufacturing expertise. They have forgotten more than almost every other company has ever known. And now Intel has is dealing with the fruits, I guess you could say, of its mistakes made over the past decades where it failed to get into mobile and missed the AI turn, and it got outflanked by the likes of TSMC as well as Nvidia, as well as just name all the chip companies. Unfortunately, and now we're seeing both Broadcom and TSM making real bids to figure out if they can take pieces of Intel's factories. And of course, they have to talk to the Trump administration about this because obviously we are not going to let U.S. chip making capabilities fall into foreign hands. So this is actually kind of a tricky. It's kind of tricky that all the best chip makers are overseas and want to bail out Intel, but how are they going to do it while maintaining a U.S. based company?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a challenge. I do think it is I'm not sure national security, but I mean, definitely a national concern. I think clearly technology, AI in general, is a key part of our national competitiveness. And so I think there are definitely some legitimate concerns about it, but the difficulty is Stargate and what have you, and the CHIPS Act aside, it's very difficult. It takes an enormous amount of money. I mean, at the end of the day, the reason Intel's in this challenge is that unlike, say, a software company, unlike when Microsoft went through this, while they had all of the challenges of changing a very large organization and dealing with cultural change, they didn't have the issue of having to deal with physical plant. And that's, Intel's biggest challenge is it's been very, very difficult to pivot. I mean, these are very big long-term bets, and if you miss them, which they did twice,
Mm-hmm.
it's really hard to recover from that, from just the amount of physical investment. And so that's, I think, the thing that's going to make this whole thing tricky on both sides. But in either case, I mean, whichever way that plays out, I think, I think putting my CIO hat, I'm not sure that there's any dramatic impact to me if I'm looking at it from if I was sitting as CIO today. but it's still one of these things that's sort of sad, and I think also speaks to just the rate of change and the fact that we used to have these sort of handful of stalwarts that we sort of knew anchored us. We may have all this turmoil going on, but we had these sort of anchors, and I think we're increasingly finding those anchors have been ripped from the seafloor, and we're all sort of adrift and have to figure it out. So
Yeah,
we'll see.
yeah, from the CIO perspective, I think my biggest concern here is what happens if Intel, chip manufacturing capabilities do get sold off. What kind of chips will we be making? And then in call it worst case scenario or worst case scenario, what if free trade is further restricted and we have trouble accessing Taiwanese chips for whatever reason? It's definitely a possibility with this administration. Definitely, there have been talks about it. So trying to figure out basically and then figuring out what chips will be allowed to be made on the Intel manufacturing, the Intel factories, the chip manufacturing plant equipment, and how long will it take to get there. I think roadmaps will get switched significantly, possibly for the better, but then again, we're talking about 3 to 5 years to be able to do any of that anyways.
And I mean, and this is, I think, the point is, if you're a CIO, so much of your exposure to the chip level has been abstracted away between cloud and other services. I think, and that's what I'm saying. It's sort of less of an issue today than it would have been even 5 years ago. But anyhow, I think it's something to be aware of. Speaking of things to be aware of, and sort of in the same category, AWS have announced some quiet changes to their marketplace rules. Nothing that I think has an impact from a technology stack perspective per se, but it's certainly going to potentially make life more complicated if you're a CIO in terms of how they're approaching their marketplace. I forget what they call it, but their commitments that you're making if you're an AWS customer.
Right. So traditionally, AWS has allowed any app sold on its marketplace to be considered part of your AWS spend. Obviously, if you're an AWS job, AWS is probably your biggest expense in IT. So you obviously want to get to those higher discount tiers and get as much spend there. Now, Amazon is going to require that any app that you get those discount tiers on has to be 100% hosted on AWS instead of just using some AWS services. And that totally makes sense from Amazon's perspective. Why would you want to give discounts on SaaS that is not on the AWS platform? You're not taking advantage of that compute. And that totally makes sense. But it does mean that you are probably going to have to watch out for some of the apps that you're using. And if you are considering those discounts to be a sure thing to come through for the rest of the year, the vendor needs to commit to AWS, or they need to perhaps help you out a little bit from a contractual or discounting perspective. This is definitely something for your IT sourcing people to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I do think one of the things that it points to, and we've talked about this in the abstract or in the big picture for a while, this idea of the major platform players. And I think this is a good reminder. And mind you, I'm a fan of AWS. I think they do fantastic work. I think they're very much tuned into the needs of the enterprise and all of that. And I don't begrudge them this, right? I agree with you on that level. The flip side of it, though, is it's a very stark reminder, and again, this goes for all the major platform players, that their focus is on your spend in their platform, within their ecosystem. And I think that you see the same thing. We talked last week about ServiceNow's approach with agentic AI and how that was going to be very centric around their ecosystem. Same thing with Salesforce's. We're going to talk a minute about SAP. And all of these players, when you're dealing with this major platform, their primary objective with everything they're doing is to pull you into that orbit, and everything is around that. And so I think as a CIO, you need to be very, very concerned and aware of that. And this is an example where it's like, on the one hand, if I'm wearing an AWS hat, it would make total sense. If I'm wearing the CIO hat, it complicates things dramatically, because the things that I'm most interested in, if I'm a CIO, is how do I have multi-vendor support? How do I ensure that I can move workloads dynamically between providers? And so some of the gray area with this announcement is, well, what happens if I have an application that can run entirely on AWS compute and the AWS ecosystem, but also has the ability to migrate a workload into another environment. And there are apps that are doing that as a way of providing security or a surety around that, to have resiliency. As a CIO, it makes perfect sense. Well, is that going to violate it, even if my workloads are, in this case, running all in AWS? So I think it's going to certainly complicate it. And it, like I said, it just is a very stark reminder that these platforms, while on the one hand, it makes sense to simplify, to put all of your eggs in one basket, you're sort of, you're buying into that.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to me because the three major clouds, AWS, Microsoft, and Google, have had different types of policies for SaaS. They all have marketplaces, of course. Google has basically always required that you have everything on Google to get everything discounted. AWS and Microsoft were more flexible. And now, surprisingly, right now, Microsoft is the most flexible of these three clouds in terms of allowing SaaS applications that don't necessarily have everything on Azure still be part of your discounted spend. And I just find that odd that Microsoft would be the most flexible of the three in anything, at least for now. Although that's actually been a trait of Microsoft Azure. The cloud team has been fairly flexible, but I just find it ironic after so many years of dealing with Microsoft audits and Microsoft contracts that this is the case right now.
It is an interesting world we're living in, and does speak, again, I think, I mentioned I'm a fan of AWS, so I'm also obviously a fan of Microsoft and their ability to pivot and how they've really turned things around. And this is part of it. I think they've done a really good job of that. So other news, Glean, a company, if you've been following, is historically they've been around for a few years, but an enterprise search company. They were extremely well funded, and they have entered the agentic fray. Full disclosure, Glean is what I would consider a competitor to what we are now doing at Symphony AI. So just keep that in mind, I guess. But I think it's interesting. They introduced, what are they calling it? Glean Agents, which is a new product that is, here's what I find really interesting about what they chose to do. They are considered one of the leaders in enterprise search. And yet, at least from what I can tell in this announcement, this came out 6 days ago, is that their agentic AI platform is effectively a builder tool that looks like it is predominantly competing with what ServiceNow just announced and what Salesforce's Agentforce out there, where it says they're calling it, I love the language actually, a horizontal agent environment, this idea of an agent environment that spans across a horizontal landscape. But it doesn't seem like they're really tying it in and connecting it to their enterprise search roots, which I find somewhat perplexing. But in either case, they're out there trying to compete in that space. And I think, from trying to put my analyst hat on, I look at this and say, why are you going out there and trying to compete with these big giants in this space? And what I didn't see in there, maybe you caught something, but I didn't see anything that was truly differentiated if I'm competing against those guys. So it was a little interesting from my perspective.
Yeah, I saw capabilities for data-driven agents, which is fine, but honestly, every BI company out there is doing the same thing, creating agents and natural language capabilities to be able to query both structured and unstructured data. And there's not much of a workflow component, which how could there be? Because that's not what Glean does. So I am not sure where the market for these particular agents is. And I think this is potentially a problem for companies that are in the search space or the enterprise content space that are getting into agents. So this both includes the, say, Workados and Zapiers of the world, as well as the, say, OpenTexts of the world that are looking purely from a content perspective, that there has to be more. You have to be able to take action. I'm not saying that these companies can't get into the agent space or that your company can't, Charles, but I do think that you have to be able to take action in some meaningful way for these agents to be useful at the end of the day. Simply accessing more data is not enough to make these agents really
well
useful.
and I guess what what I'd argue, and this was like, to the extent that it was a criticism, my criticism of what Glean just did is that I think the trick is to use AI to play to your strengths, right? How do you do this? And so let's talk about it. Someone who I think on the flip side, I think is doing an excellent job of this. And that is Snowflake. So Snowflake has introduced what they're calling Cortex AI, and it's their agentic AI solution. In partnership with Anthropic, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Anthropic. I think has maybe finally woken up and is now competing much more in terms of the hearts and minds of the AI world here. They've had a whole bunch of stuff going on, so this is one of them. Partnering with Snowflake, and what I think is really interesting about it is they are very correctly, Snowflake is very correctly identifying that they need when they're calling it data agent, right? Recognizing that when you're looking at data, right? So Snowflake is a data company. When they're looking at data, that you have this combination of structured and unstructured data, and using agentic AI is a great use of actually helping bring that data together. That currently they're very different sort of data sets, and it's very difficult to merge them, and using the combination of their historical foundation structured data and agentic AI's and generative AI's ability to deal with unstructured data, that you can bring these together and actually create agents that help you truly and rapidly analyze the data. And I think it's a compelling case. It's a compelling use case for how to use this in a way. And then on top of it, they're not trying to reinvent the wheel here, and they're using Anthropic and their agentic AI framework as the LLM layer. I think it makes a ton of sense. And I think it's a very smart approach to how to bring AI into an established product.
Yeah, just having these more targeted outputs, I think, is an important step forward, because at the end of the day, most businesses are not trying to simply do discovery for its own sake. There is going to be some sort of structured output that needs to be created and supported. And Snowflake has had that enterprise data mindset from the get-go, owning the entire stack, and then going from all the data, which they want to be in Snowflake, of course, to the actual work products that need to be created. And so I see it as going a step further if we're going to compare it to the Glean announcement.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting too is that they go. I mean, I think what we'll be sharing in the thing is their blog post, which goes fairly deep into how they're structured this architecturally. And I mean, Snowflake has always done a really good job of sort of exposing the inner workings of how they approach it, which I think as an enterprise IT buyer would give me a lot of trust, and I think that's a really smart approach. And they are absolutely dealing with the specific elements of how they are solving problems. And again, I think what they are doing a really great job of is being laser focused on the problems they're trying to solve. And I think that's just a winning combination. I mean, if you're on the flip side, if you're an enterprise software maker, take note. This is what you want to be doing, right? Laser focusing on a problem, figuring out how you can leverage technology to specifically solve it in a unique way. And we'll see. Proof will be in the pudding. But I so far I'm impressed with what the announcement is. Now let's talk about the flip side of it. And it's not really the flip side. I don't know this is negative, but I'm more questionable. And this is their Snowflake's big competitor, Databricks, has announced a partnership with SAP. And this isn't really about Databricks. I think for Databricks, it's actually a very smart move. But for SAP, it's sort of a question mark. So they're calling it the SAP Business Data Cloud. And you're probably, I'll tee it up and then you can dive into it because you probably know this better than I do. But from what I remember of what they've announced, it sounds like they're basically taking what had been 3 different products. SAP has this problem with like a lot of the big companies with all these different sort of borderline competing, borderline adjacent products. They're bringing them all together and then adding in what looks like more or less off the shelf Databricks, maybe tuned a little bit to the SAP data ecosystem. To try to create an analytics environment or consolidated that to me is sort of an answer to Salesforce's use of MuleSoft as a sort of data in the middle sort of thing. So I think it's the right move. My concern is it feels like it's just a wrapper, and that they aren't really in fact doing anything new. They're just trying to have create something new out of thin air a little bit. So I don't. What was your take on this announcement?
Yeah. So the tricky thing about SAP, as anybody who's ever had to administrate SAP knows is that the data schema is very clunky and enormous, often very customized, and it's difficult to get the exact information you're getting with simply staying within the SAP ecosystem. As much as SAP wants to help with that, obviously SAP has all the tools from a business intelligence and data management perspective, but let's be honest, they're not always the best. So one thing that's been happening significantly is that SAP customers are increasingly pouring their data into Snowflake to be able to better understand what is happening within their data, because obviously Snowflake is the easiest place to manage a data warehouse and then to be able to extract data and do analysis. And SAP is noticing this and figuring this hodgepodge of technologies we have to try to support that is not working quite as well. So they notice, who does Snowflake always compete against? Databricks. So you look at Databricks SQL, what Databricks has been doing from a data warehouse perspective, what Databricks has in terms of its catalog, and being able to wrap that all together. And they say, here's the toolkit that we can use to make it easier for SAP customers to be able to access both their data and then, more importantly, the metadata to be able to create context to be able to take next steps. So now they're going to market together jointly. It's not that SAP is new to data or doesn't have data tools, but they know that Databricks is going to honestly maintain these tools and keep them modern and performant and flexible with third parties to an extent that SAP may not be able to do. And of course, this is kind of a problem because SAP did have prior partners in a bunch of these areas. And of course, SAP is trying to play up that they still want to work with Calibra, but if they're using the Databricks catalog, that obviously is competitive to that partnership.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, I guess, where I'm going with that. Look, I think in the end, there's nothing but upside here. If you're an SAP customer, this has been an ongoing challenge. This ideally gives you another avenue and a way to simplify it. I wish this was, and maybe it will be, maybe this is the first step on an evolution to something that's a more comprehensive approach, but I'm not entirely convinced of that. But in either case, I think it's absolutely wonderful for Databricks. It gives Databricks access to the entire SAP user base in a co-selling environment. And as the analyst over Constellation pointed out, it does not include Databricks' more advanced products. So it now creates an upsell channel across all of it. So there's upside for years on, for this on Databricks. So I think for Databricks, it's a no-brainer. And like I said, I think it's still good for SAP and SAP's customers. I think it's just probably not as big of a deal as the marketing team probably wants you to think. But
yes, and this is something that Databricks has been good at for throughout the years. They have an Azure Databricks product, they have an AWS Databricks product, and one of the things I do think they do that's really smart is that when they commit to a product, they do to a new product partnership, they literally treat that as a separate product and separate go-to-market. They give it the focus of a product that they have to manage going forward, rather than simply putting some paper together and saying, hey, we're going to sell this together. So I'm actually pretty interested in seeing what Databricks ends up doing to support the SAP product. And SAP might have seen that as a strategic advantage as well, having another team of people who are focused on basically modernizing SAP.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot of ground cover, so we should move on. But I think the big challenge here, if I look at the difference in strategy, I mentioned MuleSoft and Salesforce, is I think that I don't think SAP could have acquired Databricks, but I think they probably would have been better served by acquiring a data company and actually fully embedding it and truly transforming it versus this. So I hear what you're saying about Databricks' approach, but at the end of the day, Databricks is still a separate company, and that's going to always limit their extensibility. So like I said, I look at this more of a marketing thing than I do anything else. And that doesn't make it bad, but it just makes it a little bit of fluff. Speaking of marketing fluff, Workday, I think, has won this week's prize for marketing fluff in that they announced, what are they calling it here? Their
agent system of record.
Agent system of record. So honestly, I read this thing 3 times. I'm still not sure what the heck it is. So the idea is a platform that allows you to manage people, humans and agents together in one place They have their own marketplace of agents. They have their own agents. That part sort of makes sense, but they're claiming all agents anywhere. And I don't, for the life of me, they don't explain in any way, shape, or form how they would do that or what that means or what, unless it's just a catalog where I type it in. It's like, I don't know what that means. So I don't know if you had more, if you've been briefed on it, but it was very confusing to me.
Yeah, so this is a problem that we're going to talk about in the next section as well. But basically, we know that enterprises are going to have this challenge of managing thousands and thousands of agents, and they're going to have to track it in some way. Workday is taking the thesis that agents are similar to employees in some ways in terms of the skills they have. So they're putting this inventory of agents together, and they have this vision of showing what skills the agent has and what roles the agent has, what maybe departments the agent might be assigned to, and then being able to do things like cost and ROI and all this other stuff. When I've asked Workday about this so far and had to try to also answer this question for clients, it's actually been a bit of a challenge because what I can get so far, I think there's not much more here than basically the ability to inventory your agents, which I do think is a necessary starting point. But as we know on the IT side, the real challenge is going to be about orchestration and upgrading and support over time. All these things that Workday isn't seen as the expert in doing from an IT perspective.
Well, and I think, I don't, we were talking about it before we started recording that there was some other company like 6 months ago that made some noise about trying to manage AI the same way, and they were roundly ridiculed. And I don't know if Workday is going to get sort of the same reception, but I think it speaks to, well, it speaks to things. I think it speaks to a bit of a flailing on Workday's part. And I'm a fan of Workday in general, and we know that they're trying to shift and broaden their base. But I look at this and say this is this fear that we're gonna, I don't know, have humans replaced by AI, and therefore we need to pivot so that we don't get left behind. But I think it's a completely flawed metaphor. I mean, I know that we often will talk about it in this way, but there's very little evidence of us actually replacing humans with AI at this stage of the game. And as we just talked about, not all agents like the Snowflake agents we just talked about, they're not really replacing a human in the traditional way. We're taking specific actions that make sense and we're using them to drive automation or to provide assistance or to augment a human in the loop or whatever it might be. And so I think the broader question of how we handle AI governance is extremely legitimate and more than legitimate, necessary. But I think trying to be reductive and treating all AI agents as quote unquote employees, I think is short-sighted and just leads us to the wrong position, which is why that you alluded to the other side of this, and that is that Cisco, and it's, I'm not sure what this is, Outshift by Cisco. I think this is like a think tank of theirs or something. I'm not really sure, but they've produced a paper on something what they're calling the Internet of Agents. Now, I'm going to say on the record, I'm not sure that I agree with this as being the ultimate right approach, but I think it's at least much more in the right direction. And their basic premise is that through their study, they estimate that the average enterprise is going to have 20,000 agents or more running within the walls of the enterprise. I think you and I both agree with that number, that it's going to be this massive tech estate. And that therefore we need a way in a holistic, agnostic manner to manage them, which means we need standardization and we need, much like we did. So this is obviously playing the Internet of Things, which it's not a great example because the Internet of Things has really never completely coalesced around these industry standards either. So it's been a marketing buzzword, but the concept of having this kind of common playing field for the agents to operate on, I think makes a lot more sense and certainly aligns more with the sort of the technical orientation that I have of how this all fits. So, I mean, what was your take on their strategy, I guess, that they're putting out here?
Yeah, I think that Cisco has a decent idea here, but I do think that there's going to be some trickiness in getting these agents to talk to each other because we are traditionally used to having applications and services talk to each other basically through APIs. We've been in an API world for a past decade, and that's important because everything is programmatic and software based. But I do think that agents just due to their nature, also have this generative AI component. We're starting to see these computer use agents that are making decisions based on inputs and screen views and things like that. They're actually able to respond to external circumstances to some degree. And I think that is going to have to be part of the Internet of Agent logic. And I'm not sure how much Cisco is going to be comfortable with doing that, being, I've always thought of them as a network and infrastructure company and fantastic at it. But how much do they understand about the UX that generative AI and graphics create that would lead to kind of the more human interactions associated with agents?
So I haven't read their research paper. They have a detailed paper, and I haven't gone through it yet. And so I'm curious. I mean, the fact that it's Cisco implies to me that they may be considering something similar to like the OSI stack, right? Where these agents now have an embedded layer that sort of identify themselves and say, "This is what my domain, and this is how I work," or I don't know what. But and I don't know if that's sustainable or workable either, but at least it's intriguing, right? Where, I mean, because to your point, the challenge that we have with this sort of API based metaphor, and by the way, as an example, Snowflake is exposing their agents via an API, right? So this is the common approach right now: is we do an API call, the agents go do their thing, and we send a response. But when you start talking about truly massive agent orchestration, that is nowhere near. It's too slow, it's too cumbersome, it's too deterministic. And you can see that it's not going to work. We need much more of a meshed approach. And so that's why this idea of the Internet of Agents makes conceptual sense, but it requires us adding a metadata layer that is then has a common kind of component to it that no one's really talking about right now. So I welcome the conversation. I'm very curious. I'm going to read through the research or the white paper to see exactly where they're going with it. But I guess my big point is juxtaposing it to the Workday. I think this is a much more thoughtful approach to how you're going to deal with it versus simply trying to abstract. And look, I think there's going to be cases where it makes sense to treat some of your agents as quote unquote employees, especially as they advance. But for the most part, I think that the vast majority of this number, whatever it ends up being, is actually not going to operate that way. It's going to operate much more like a microservice operates.
Yeah, I think there's going to be, so I'm a FinOps guy. And when I've looked at each of these IT management categories I look at across telecom, network, mobility, software, and cloud, there always ends up being kind of at least two systems of record that happen. One that is kind of an inventory and cost-based perspective, which I think Workday is actually well prepared to support because they do contingent labor, they have a financial planning and budgeting solution. They have inventory, obviously. They have analytic capabilities from their Prism analytics. So they have all this stuff to be able to look at that behavior. I don't think they're well equipped to look at the orchestration and transactional behavior that agents do, where Cisco is obviously going to be a much stronger player. And so they're doing different sides, but I think the technical side is honestly going to build out first. I think
And I think it's going to be a
Workday.
tougher problem to solve. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's going to be incredibly complex, and the stakes are high. So let's we're going to run way along here, but
Yeah.
there's another study, and no big surprise. PegaSystems. We haven't heard much about Pega lately, but I guess they did a survey and found, shocker, shocker, that workers are worried about AI agents for accuracy and quality, and for a lot of the stuff. And you'll hear me rail against the sort of builder approach. Not that it's bad, but that it's fraught with these sort of challenges. And this is why. And this is going to speak to those issues. So I don't know if you had anything else. I mean, I thought it was an interesting data point, but it speaks to the fact that any of us in the space have a lot of ground to cover to get employees, the workers, to actually have some faith and trust in it.
Yep. Just a reminder that, this is just another data point here saying, among other things, 40% of employees are really worried about using agents in the workplace. They don't want to use them, not because they don't think it will be productive, but because they are afraid of the consequences. They don't know the rules. This is an educational process because on the executive side, it's really clear. The executives want AI to be used. Employees actually do want to use it, but they don't know how in the big picture company perspective.
Yeah, well, and there's governance challenges. I mean, and again, not to pick
Mhm.
on ServiceNow. We talked last week about their commercial or whatever you call it, their video,
Mhm.
their ad, and I thought it did a good job, but it fails to answer some of those questions. So if you create those agents, then and those agents do something ridiculous, who's responsible? Is that employee responsible? Is the employee actually building it? Right? I mean, there's all those kind of challenges and issues when you have an agent taking autonomous action. Who is in fact then held accountable when that action goes awry? And which leads to the other sort of piece of research, I guess, or a survey, and this one from the Register, talking about
Mhm.
how sort of not. Well, actually, I did find it surprising. So they're quoting data from Anthropic, a study that Anthropic did as part of their new Anthropic Economic Index, but found that only 4%. The headline is only 4% of jobs relying heavily on AI, and that it's mostly in mid-wage roles. Although I have some issues with this data, so I'll pause there and let you tee it up before I challenge it.
Yeah. So Anthropic has put a bunch of economists and social scientists together in-house as part of their organization and started this economic index to try to figure out how AI is being used. And although they're seeing roughly a third of users saying that they use AI in a fair number of tasks, they say that 75% of their usage is done by 4% of their jobs. So still it's very top heavy in terms of the usage that is happening. And obviously, a lot of the work being done is based on coding or graphic and text creation.
I mean, I think one of the issues, I had a couple of issues with this from the standpoint. One is you have a little bit of confirmation bias, right? AI is still a leading edge technology. So, of
Mhm.
course, you're going to see more people in technology and those domains using it. So, I don't know if that's really indicative of the eventual use case play, or, how the dispersion looks. Secondly, I found it interesting their categorization, that to be at this top use, you had to have 75% of your activities somehow supported through AI. I consider myself a power user. I use it all day long, and I guarantee I'm nowhere near that number, right? A
Mhm.
huge, massive amount of my work has nothing to do with me using AI to do it. And so by its category, I'm way down the list. And it's like, so it's like, I don't know what these people are doing, that they're using 75% of their tasks are using AI. So I sort of had some issues with that, but I do think it is interesting, that there is, well, I was surprised on the one hand that 43% are actually seeing work automation versus 57% of augmentation. But again, I look at that and say, well, what does that mean? That doesn't mean 43% are completely replacing workers. It just means
Mhm.
it's completely replacing complete tasks. And that makes a lot of sense, right? And that actually kind of plays out. So, I think what I think I'm most I sort of discounting, frankly, some of the data itself, but what I'm applauding is this idea of this is the first player in the space that's using creating meaningful data, and I forgot, they're using a company to anonymize it, but that's actually using the actual data to give us some insight as to how this is being used. And
Mhm.
I think that's the critical thing. Even if the data itself is subject to a bunch of caveats, I think this is an important step to understanding. And I think, by the way, if you're an enterprise leader, you need to be thinking about the same thing as you start introducing AI, how you're going to measure it, how you're going to monitor it, how you're going to understand what it's doing, because there is a lot of expense involved. And I think it's a critical element to be able to get this type of data and then normalize it to your environment.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Tracking the market is an important part of understanding which AI functionalities you're going to be able to launch easily, depending on the maturity of your own organization. And this is right now an interesting benchmark there, obviously showing that we are in early adopter status at the enterprise level.
And I think that is probably the really, really important takeaway. It is easy. I mean, I find myself falling for it, even as somebody who lives and breathes this every day, of thinking that everybody is on this journey, and the reality is we are still so early
Mhm.
days. And I think it's an important thing to remember. So our last little piece of news before we wrap up is another study, this one by Microsoft. And it's funny because I mentioned before we started recording that when you first sent this over, I thought it was another study that I'd seen. I don't remember who produced it, but it basically talked about some challenges with like the cognitive load on AI platforms, that you give it more context and they can actually start underperforming. That, we right now think that more context is always better, but in some cases, depending on the use case, more context actually is worse. And what I think is what I think is interesting is, so this study is not that, but it's sort of making the same case, but on the human side. So here it's saying that this Microsoft study found that human cognition atrophied the more somebody used generative AI,
Mhm.
specifically. Now, I'm curious your take on this, because I had to download. I couldn't read the article, so I downloaded the actual report and started getting through. It's a research report, so it's pretty dense. But from what I understood, what I thought was interesting is it's self-reporting on sort of their confidence level.
Mhm.
So the question for me is it actually impacting cognitive ability around critical thinking, or is it simply um, changing my perception of how I think about myself in using it? And so I found it fascinating. I am a natural skeptic with this sort of self-reported data. I mean, I would have been much happier if they were putting electrodes on people's heads and measuring cognitive responses in some
Mhm.
ways, but um, well, I mean, I appreciate they're at least looking at it, and I think it's going to be a very valid question as we go forward. But what was your take on this piece of research?
Yeah, so I found this really interesting. The study basically saying that after looking at 300 plus knowledge workers, that they found that these workers were less secure about their work when the more they used AI. It seems to show that we as human beings need some baseline of activity, of status quo activity, to be confident in seeing whether anomalies or other critical actions are needed or not needed in terms of to take action. And I think Microsoft, to its credit, has always had a very strong research capability. One of the few tech companies that actually takes their research very seriously from a primary research perspective, even when it's not extremely uh, nice to their products, as this one seems to show. But I think the other issue is showing that as we work with agents, we need to maintain a certain benchmark of human activity and interaction with the jobs that we're doing. If we just leave it all to the agent, this better be for an activity that is overwhelmingly large for human cognition rather than simply easy to do, because over time we will lose our own sense of understanding when to take action and when not to take action for certain activities.
Well, it reminds me of, if you remember, we talked probably going close to a year ago about an article that Rex Woodbury of Digital Native produced,
Mm-hmm.
talking about the egg theory of AI, right? That there is this balance point of, as humans, we want to have an appropriate degree of participation to feel good about it. And so I feel like this research is probably tapping into that it's
Mm-hmm.
less about any actual cognitive decline, although I could be wrong on that, but more about this sense of accomplishment. And because I try to put myself, I was reading this research, I try to put myself into this. And like I said, I use AI extensively and I use it
Mm-hmm.
for all kinds of stuff. And I find it incredibly useful. And I do not find it disempowering. I find it sort of the opposite. I find it that I get better results out of it the more I put in, right? Where I'm dumping a whole bunch of my sort of like brain dumping, and here's what I'm thinking, and then it helps me take that to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of take it's like, hey, that's because I was really smart in giving it all this input that it needed to produce this result. But I could see, I can understand the context. Particularly, this goes back to what you're talking about, training and the cultural transformation. For someone who sort of doesn't know how to use it, or is
Mm-hmm.
using it in this sort of highly simplistic fashion, where it's like I say, write this letter for me, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore I feel like I'm like cheating. I can see where that's going to have this impact. So I think it goes back to being very aware, for if you're a CIO, if you're in the enterprise software space, being very, very aware of this egg theory challenge of how do you ensure that we're using AI to augment those abilities and to support them, and to actively elevate their engagement at this sort of cognitive level. So I think it's interesting. And I think I view it as some of the early, I don't know if you remember, we're old, but when gaming first started hitting the stride, what was it, 20 years ago? And there was all this uproar over how it was destroying the minds and turning kids into zombies and all this. And we actually found the opposite. We actually found it was actually really good for cognitive development, to the point that the US military now uses it not only for test training, but testing, right, as a way, because so much of what has to happen, the ability to rapidly consume this information, digest it, and make decisions, it's actually fabulous in many, many ways. And I kind of feel like we're going to see the same thing with this, that this is that first sort of brush of looking at it, and we maybe are interpreting some of it wrong because we're looking at it from the wrong perspective. But like I said, and to your point, kudos to Microsoft for asking the hard questions and digging into it, regardless of which way it lands. I think it's the right questions and the things we should be considering.
Yes, and this has been a challenge with generative AI, that because it's so confident and it always creates something that is perfectly constructed from a grammatical perspective, it skews our understanding of how accurate it can be. And if we're not engaged with the process, the agentic interaction, it is easy to feel like you're just along for the ride. You're just watching instead of being part of the team. So that's obviously something that needs to be pushed against. Agents still need humans, at least at this point in time.
Well, speaking of cognitive decline, we always like to end on a fun, crazy, weird article, and this one checks all those boxes. I know I'm showing my bias, but the Elon Musk DOGE team has been running amok. As if you've been following the news at all, it's hard to avoid it, regardless if you think it's necessary or not. And I think, of course, there's probably a little bit of both. There's an article in Fast Company talking about how the team may have a bit of a challenge, and that is in understanding COBOL, because so many of these systems are in fact running on COBOL. And there's at least some reports that that Musk was out there talking about how he uncovered all this fraud for these people that are 150 years old, and early indications are that that's actually a function of COBOL coding that has some date limitations. Some of the, by the way, if you weren't keeping track or weren't around back then, the Y2K thing was also spurred by the same thing, COBOL's really bizarre date limitations. So I think it's hilarious. As an old COBOL programmer myself, it's hilarious. I joke that this is my retirement plan, that all else fails, I will go back and become a COBOL programmer, because there's all these challenges, and the US government is probably the largest remaining user of COBOL. So I guess the DOGE team is going to have to do some brushing up.
Yes, I find this process quite odd as someone who is a former data analyst and, as I said before, FinOps person, where a lot of FinOps starts with audits of IT systems. I'm fairly I'm pretty informed on how you go about auditing an IT system and auditing for cost and auditing to cut costs. My entire firm is based on the IT rule of 30. Each unmanaged IT cost center has on average 30% in costs that could be cut. Like, I am a big fan of cutting costs and digging in. But I also know that when you're doing this type of audit, you need people who understand the underlying code that puts the data into place. You need to know which tables go with which other tables and data sources, because your original data source is usually really bad. It was created 30 or 40 years ago with a totally different set of circumstances and assumptions. And often these legacy codes are being used to show all sorts of different things that have changed over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. So whether something is true or false, on or off, being paid or not being paid, it could reflect all sorts of different things, and you need to go look at all of the other tables and metadata and processes simply to have an idea of what it means. And I know that, and I don't know the Social Security database, but I know for certain it is not something you can master in 2 days and find any sort of meaningful results. I don't care who you are. I know Elon Musk is the smartest man in the world, but I just know that you can't do that, and there are no accountants involved, which I find also extremely weird. You need your data and your programmers, obviously, but you also need your accountants. So I don't know what these people are doing, but I'm sure we'll find out more and more over time.
Well, I on one hand, I don't envy them because I think they're rapidly, the low hanging fruit of saying I'm going to, fire the 200,000 probationary workers. Okay, that's easy stuff.
Yep.
Right or wrong, whether you agree with it or not, that's easy. Now they're getting into stuff that's hard, and it's been this way, and these systems have been in place for a long time because it's hard to undo this or to fix it or to really modernize it or even understand it. And so it's I think it's going to be a challenge for them. I do think it's interesting. I mean, just from putting on the political hat for a minute, apparently privately, there's many Democrats that are sort of being wistful about it because everyone recognizes there's a ton of bloat. Everyone recognizes that I don't consider the deep state as in like nefarious, but there's no question that there's a massive amount of organizational inertia. These federal agencies have been in place for 50 years or longer with systems that predate almost anybody alive,
Mhm.
and trying to figure out how to manage and navigate through it is no easy task. And for the most part, and this is the only thing I will give Elon Musk credit for, most part people have lacked the courage and the political will to actually address it. And so I give him credit for actually doing it, but it's just bull in the china shop sort of mentality, and the whole move fast, break things mentality, which they seem to be embracing, just isn't going to fly in these environments. And so I think we're all sort of bracing for the fallout. But I just
Yeah.
personally found it somewhat humorous, the whole harking back to the COBOL days.
And I do find it, so I will say the part that I do like is they are going into the code to look at what's going on. They are looking directly at the data sources, the primary source of data, to figure out what is going on from there. Hopefully they figure out all the other layers that are involved in federal government services, the processes, the workflows. Hey, I've heard that workflows are important. Uh,
Well, I've decided that what they need is the voice of reason. So I volunteered us to join the DOGE team to try to get in there and help them fix these problems. So,
Yeehaw,
we
let's
report
go,
next week.
partner. All right. And on that note, now that we've been volunteered for the Doge team, thanks, Charlie. This has been another week, and this week in enterprise tech. If you enjoyed this, if there's anything else you want us to look into, please feel free to let us know. Please like, subscribe, and listen in. Thanks a lot. Take care.